Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the last of our 3 presidential roundtables. My wonderful colleagues and good friends, past President Tom Haas, Mark Murray, and Don Lubbers are here again to join me as we explore the condition of America's democracy before, during, and after the insurrection of January 6th. Our country has pulled together before in challenging times, yet today we continue to work through the divides of this time, of this moment. What we must do is to constantly work to form and to inform our opinions and to stay curious as we work to continuously learn about the moment, the past, and how it situates us in our future. Tonight, we have 2 eminent authors and researchers who have traveled this road and whose insights we're really eager to hear. To introduce them, here is our resident historian, President Emeritus Don Lubbers.
Thank you, Philly. Conflicts in our democracy are perhaps as consequential as any since the 19th century. When faced with such a serious condition, it is well for us to consult those who are most expert in societal analysis and best at prescribing the antidotes. We have 2 of the best as our guests. They are co-authors of The Upswing, How America Came Together a Century Ago and How We Can Do It Again, Robert Bob Putnam and Shaylyn Romney Garrett. It almost appears they wrote the book in anticipation of tonight. Bob Putnam has been asked by US presidents and British prime ministers for policy advice. He was awarded the National Humanities Medal by President Obama, served on the staff of the Security Council. He is no wonkish intellectual. The London Times called him, however, the leading intellectual of our times. He has shared his knowledge in 14 books. Shaylyn Romney Garrett has devoted herself to many initiatives encouraging people to live and function well together. She wrote a revealing statement, quote, "I often feel that community is something I have thought about more than almost anyone, but have less of than almost everyone." That is a state for creative tension. Check her personal blog, Reconnect, and read her book, American Grace, How Religion Divides and Unites Us. You will discover what she is about. Of course, we are going to find out what these 2 thoughtful people are about. And so I introduce to you Bob Putnam and Shaylyn Garrett. Welcome.
Thanks very much, President Lubbers. It is a delight to be at Grand Valley State. And as you know, it's a delight to be back, at least virtually, in Michigan. I have deep Michigan roots and deep roots in the Michigan University system, as you know. And what a pleasure it is and an honor it is for me to be speaking with you and to your supporters and students and alumni in this virtual way. What I want to do tonight is to sort of lay out very quickly, if I can, the basic empirical findings of this project, looking back over the last 125 years. And then Shaylyn will pick up the story at that point and begin to tell the narrative that knits those data together. And most important, begin to draw lessons from this history for what we face right now. I should say, just by way of preface, this book was finished and at the publisher in January of 2020. That is, the book authors know nothing about the pandemic. They know nothing about the economic collapse. They know nothing about Black Lives Matter. They know nothing about the politics. They don't even know who was running in the presidential campaign. They certainly don't know about the outcome of the presidential campaign. They know even less about that long period leading up to January 6th. They don't know that Biden takes over, and they don't know what challenges and what policies Biden is offering. We're eager to talk about those, but our ideas are based on theories and facts and understandings that we evolved long before those events happened. So we're going to talk about, in the beginning, about the past, and then we're going to be delighted with you to talk about the present and the future. So if we can have the first of the slides, I'll begin to tell you a little bit about what we're going to do. This is the cover of the book there. And if you go to the next slide, this sort of outlines what I'm going to be talking about. The fact is, Americans disagree about almost everything, but Americans are really in a pickle, as my mom used to say. America today has reached historic levels, really almost unprecedented levels in our entire history of political polarization, and separately from that, of economic inequality, and thirdly, also independently, but true, historic levels of social isolation and social fragmentation, and finally, culturally, historic levels of self-centeredness. And so the first question we ask is, how did we get here? And I'm going to show you a couple of slides quickly to show you the kind of evidence that underlies the arguments that we're making here. So if we have the next slide, all the slides are going to look roughly like this. The horizontal axis is time running over the left-hand side. They're all going to have the same shape. Over at the left-hand side is the 1880s, 1890s, what historians call the Gilded Age, the end of the 19th century. And over at the right-hand side is today. And the vertical axis shows the changing levels, in this case, of political cooperation, bipartisanship, political comity, or conversely, polarization. Down is polarization, and you can see that at the beginning of the 20th century and at the end of the 19th century, America was extremely polarized politically, very difficult to work across party lines. At the time, it seemed like the only period that had ever been America had ever been that divided politically was the period between 1860 and 1865. That is the Civil War. So we're talking about really unusual levels back then of political polarization. But then, as you can see, in the beginning of the 20th century, in the first 10 or 15 years of the 20th century, we began to pivot and go in a more hopeful direction, becoming increasingly cooperative and working in a bipartisan way across party lines. And as you can see, that trend continued through the 20s and the 30s and the 40s and continued into the 50s. And you can see that at the very peak was the middle 50s. That many of you will know, that was the presidency of Dwight Eisenhower. Appropriately enough, the least partisan president, all historians agree, the least partisan president in American history. It's not that he caused this depolarization and this cross-party collaboration. He was a symptom of that trend. And it continued after the Eisenhower presidency through the 60s and into the beginning of the 70s. But then suddenly, surprisingly, that trend reversed. And beginning in the 70s, we began to become somewhat more polarized again. And as you can see, that trend toward increasing polarization continued down through the 80s and through the 90s and into the 21st century and down through the 2010s and down. And actually, exactly, if the graph continued down, polarization, as you will know, has extended even further in the last 5 or 6 years. So we're now at a level that is a greater polarization than in the earliest of this curve. And that means we're down at the level of civil war. I don't mean that we're about to have violent civil war breakout, but in terms of the degree of distance and lack of cooperation across party lines, we're in really historic territory here. Let's have the next slide and look at the trends for economic inequality. Same basic chart. Over at the left-hand side is the end of the 19th century, and over at the right-hand side is the really beginning of the 21st century. this data actually began in 1913, because that's when the IRS was created, and we begin to have really hard data on the gap between rich and poor. But we know a fair amount about what it was like even earlier than that. And this is a period, both the period beginning in 1913, but also for the preceding 10 or 20 or 30 years, that's called the Gilded Age in American society, because it was that was a period of an enormous gap between rich folks and poor folks, epitomized by the east side of the island of Manhattan. Up on the Upper East Side is where all the millionaires of that era lived, the robber barons of that period. And down on the Lower East Side, not more than 10 miles away, was the other end of the economic spectrum, where lived millions, really, of poor, impoverished immigrants. That's what life was like at the beginning of the 20th century. Great, great economic inequality. But then you could see, beginning around beginning in the first decade or two of the 20th century, we begin to have greater equality, rising equality. There's a pause in the 20s. That's the period of the Roaring 20s, when the people in the stock market did pretty well. But then coming out of the 20s into the 30s, through the Great Depression and the New Deal, but also continuing steadily afterwards, up, greater equality, little pause after World War II, but then even greater equality, reaching a peak in around 1960. Of course, it was not perfect equality, but comparatively speaking, America at that point looked statistically like Sweden, a very equal distribution of income. But then as the 60s continued, and especially as we get through the 70s, we begin to have a reversal of the trend and greater growing inequality, and a dramatic change through the 80s and 90s and 2000s and down into the 2010s. And then for a while, it looked as though maybe that trend was going to end there. But no, again, we know that in the last 5 or 6 years, there's been an even greater inequality. So now we're down, if we show the data up to today, we're way down at the bottom, and probably about as unequal certainly as unequal as we were in the early part of this century, and probably as unequal as America has ever been. The gap between rich and poor, very great. Let's go to the next slide. Here we're going to be looking at social ties, the cohesion, the degree to which Americans are connected with one another, what I, in an earlier book called Bowling Alone, what I called social capital. This is the networks of family and friends and community institutions and social trust that hold this society together. But at the beginning of the 20th century, America, and Shaylyn will say a little bit more about what this looked like at the time, America was very divided, socially lacking in trust, lacking in social connectedness. Even the family was many people didn't get married in that period. If they got married, they got married very late, and they had relatively few kids. But then, as you can see, at the beginning of the 20th century, that began to change, and we began to have more and more people joining clubs and taking part in religious congregations. Another graph that looks exactly like that. Membership in trade unions, another important social network, looks just exactly like this. You can see it rose during the 20s. Again, the pause in the 20s, but then through the 30s and through the 40s and through the 50s and into the 60s, probably the greatest civic boom in American history. And of course, that showed up in unprecedentedly high levels of social trust. People trusted one another, high levels of family coherence. Almost everybody was getting married in that period. That's the baby boom. And they were getting married very young, and almost everybody had kids. But then again, as we ended the 60s, that began to turn the other direction, and steady declines in social connections of all of these types. Fewer people belonging to church congregations, fewer people belonging to unions, fewer people belonging to other organizations, including bowling leagues, down, 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 down. And again, it has continued down to right now. Let's look at the last of these 4 dimensions. We want to talk about culture here a little bit. And it's a little harder to measure this, but I'm proud of the way we've got some really pretty hard indicators of the degree to which people in America have felt that we're all in this together. That's high solidarity, high social capital, or that it's everybody up for himself, and the devil take the hindmost. And at the end of the 19th century, in the 1890s period, as again, Shaylyn will talk a little bit more about this, what this looked like in practice, very low levels of cultural solidarity. America was in a very, I would say, I period, focused on the I and not the we. But then beginning in the beginning of the 20th century, increasing focus on what we have in common, increasing focus on the we, and that steadily rose. You can again see a little bit of a pause during the 20s, but steadily increasing through the 30s, through the 40s, through the 50s, into the 60s, and then suddenly, bizarrely, again, this downturn. And we had reached a peak of kind of we up there at the top, but then steadily declining since then. And once again, all the evidence shows steady, uninterrupted declines. And again, if we had the data up to 2021, again, we would find great emphasis on I. I've been using the terms I and we because we've come to call this the I, we, I curve. If we have the next slide quickly, this shows how all of those graphs fit together. They're the same curve. Even though they're measured in very different ways, and they're about economics and politics and society and culture, all of these trends show this same basic pattern, the I, we, I curve. And if we can have the next graph quickly, this puts them all together. This is a factual summary of how America has changed, beginning at the end of the 19th century, a very I-centered America, unequal, polarized, socially fragmented, and focused on self-interest, rising to a we at the middle of the 20th century, and then over the last 50 years, a steady decline back of greater inequality, greater political polarization, greater fragmentation, greater I-ness. And now, at this point, I want to turn the turn the slide and the story over to Shaylyn, who's going to begin here and then tell us a little bit what was happening behind these numbers, and finally, most important, what lessons we can learn from this period. Shaylyn?
So, there are a lot of questions about how we got here, which is the question that Bob opened our presentation with today. How did we get in to this multifaceted national crisis that we find ourselves in as a nation? And one of the reviewers of our book noted that there have been many books in the last decade or so that have aimed to answer that question. And this reviewer even called those books the How We Got Into This Mess genre. And our book, of course, falls into that genre. However, it's different from a number of these other books in a handful of ways. I think it's clear that it's been identified that America has been on this downward slide in the last half century in each of these different areas that Bob has highlighted. But I think what's less known is what was going on in the half century before that downward slide, which, as we can see from the data that Bob has presented, was that within living memory for the oldest Americans, all of those downward trends were moving in the opposite direction. We're moving in the right direction, in a positive direction. And so what is the lesson then of this I, we, I century? Well, one way to look at this is as an argument that America has sort of fallen from grace, that we need to sort of get back to a time when everything was less polarized and everyone was more connected, that America had sort of a golden age at mid-century. And we want to be clear to emphasize that this is really not the message of the Upswing. This is not a Make America Great Again book. On the contrary, there are many problems that were a part of that mid-century peak of we. It certainly was not the highest we could have ever gone toward we. It certainly was not the ideal scenario in America for reasons that I'll get into a little bit later. But more than that, we find that looking to a moment when a trend culminated is less instructive than actually looking at the moment when the trend began. And the reason for that is, by pure hard data, we can see that the situation America finds itself in today, we've been in once before. Almost to a remarkable extent, America has been here before. We have weathered this very same multifaceted storm before. And that time was, of course, the Gilded Age, the turn of the last century, the turn of the 20th century, when the Gilded Age gave way to the Progressive Era. At that time, just as we see today, there were many doomsday prophecies about America's democracy going off the rails. However, we can see from the data that none of those prophecies was actually fulfilled. On the contrary, America turned upward and entered a multifaceted, multi-decade upswing that carried us through 60 to 70 years before that trend began to reverse. And so, for us, the question of the upswing is, what lessons can we learn from this upturn? If ever there were a historical moment whose lessons we need to learn, it's the moment when the last upswing began. So I want to go to the next slide here and highlight just a few of the lessons of this last upswing. We're talking again about the moment when the Gilded Age gave way to the Progressive Era. And I want to be clear that when we speak about the progressive era, we're not using the term progressive in quite the same way that we hear it used today. Progressive, we might call small p progressivism, which we hear a lot about today, is really about the leftmost end of the political spectrum. However, when we're talking about the progressive era, we're using the term, we might call it capital P progressivism, which was a much more broad movement. It was not necessarily just one side of the political spectrum. It was actually a movement that historians have called so diverse as to be barely coherent. It had a lot of competing factions in it. It had a lot of different issues at play, but the progressives themselves were really united by a couple of different things. One was a compelling desire to repudiate the downward drift of the nation. And the second was a galvanizing belief in the power of ordinary citizens to do that. And so, what are some of the themes or lessons from the progressive era that we might be able to apply today if we have hope of initiating another upswing from this multifaceted crisis that we're in now? So the first one might be surprising. So again, as Bob noted, this book is primarily a statistical story. Each of the graphs that he presented doesn't represent just one variable, but scores of different data sets that have been combined to illustrate these trends. And so when we're looking at so many different data points and we have all these different curves, many people rightfully ask, well, what was the leading indicator? If we can identify from a statistical standpoint which of these trends started moving in the right direction first, well, then maybe we would have a clue about what the silver bullet was that kind of pulled or drove all of these different trends upward. And so a lot of people assume, actually, between our four metrics, which are society, politics, culture, and economics, they actually assume that the leading variable or the driver of these things was economics. And I think Bob might admit that he even came to this study with that mindset as well. And I think that's a common bias that we see, particularly in the social scientists and in the social sciences, which is just this idea that sort of this kind of Marxist view of history that that everything is economics and the rest is just details, right? Well, it turns out to be fascinating that in the data, it is quite clear that economics is actually a lagging indicator, meaning that it was one of the things to change the very last of this this sort of story of four different measures of American society. So the question is, if economics was not leading this trend, this upswing, what was? It's a little bit hard to say. Bob, of course, is our world-class political scientist and data scientist, so he could explain this in more detail. But quickly, it's a little bit like, when you're looking at so many different statistical measures, we like to sort of say it's a little bit like looking like a flock of birds in flight, where they're moving in one direction, and then all of a sudden they all change and go in a different direction. As we saw with that confluence of curves, all of these things were changing within remarkably similar time frame. So it's a little bit hard to look at that, like you would look at a flock of birds and say, well, which one of those turned first? It's a little tricky to do. But as we pair the statistical data with the historical record, what we see is that it appears that a moral and cultural shift was actually what led all of these changes. It was a moral awakening that was on the front end of change in the progressive era. So, culturally speaking, the Gilded Age was characterized by something called social Darwinism, which was the idea that, Charles Darwin had recently articulated the survival of the fittest as a description of how the natural world works. And there were people who said, oh, well, we should then take that theory and apply it to how we build our society, that we sort of should fashion this as one giant competition in which only the strong will survive. And as Bob mentioned earlier, the devil take the hindmost, right? And it's a little bit hard to believe today that that was sort of a way that people felt was a good way to organize society. And the results were quite clear. There was huge gap between rich and poor, huge failure of compromise in the public square. And into that cultural moment came a movement called the social gospel. This was a movement that came out of evangelical Protestantism originally, but that ultimately became more of a broad cultural shift in America that really challenged sort of the primary conceptions or the foundational ideas about what society was about. There began to be really articulate commentators saying, our society should not be a competition, but should rather be about what we can do for each other, what responsibilities we have to one another, and how we can care for the most vulnerable in our society. And so these social gospelers began to articulate a new vision for America, a new morality for America, or a new values-based foundation for the formation of American society. And what's interesting about this shift, about the progressives who were involved in this cultural shift, is that they weren't just engaging in cultural critique or sort of pointing the finger at the idle rich and saying, we need to expel these bad apples from society and then everything will be fine. In fact, the historian Richard Hofstadter described these progressives as being characterized by a moral indignation directed inward. These were reformers who were interested not in just reforming things outside of themselves, but also reforming their hearts, reforming their own beliefs, and recognizing their own complicity in the destructive and exploitative systems that characterized the America that they found themselves in. And so we believe that today, if we are to see another upswing, it's likely that we will need to see a cultural and moral shift away from this hyper-individualistic moment that we find ourselves in and back toward a more we, communitarian, or solidarity-oriented cultural mindset. That's likely to be what happens on the front end, as it certainly was in the progressive era. Another few aspects of this that I want to highlight. Who were these reformers that were having this change of heart? Many of them were very young. This was an incredibly youth-driven movement. Most of the reformers who were doing important work in the progressive era were doing so when they were under the age of 30. We often tend to think of the progressives as the sort of Jane Addamses who were sort of in their older years. We think of pictures of Jane Addams receiving the Nobel Peace Prize. But actually, that came quite a bit later. She was actively doing innovative work to change society on the ground when she was very young. And to a large extent, we believe that the same thing will be true today, that the fate of America really lies in the hands of the post-boomer generation who can be innovative in their approach to building a new society. Certainly, the young people today have not caused this crisis or these problems that we have, but we believe that they will be the source of the solutions as they were so importantly during the progressive era. Another aspect of this is that the progressives were very focused on association building. Association is kind of an antiquated term that maybe we wouldn't use today. We might use a term like connection or community or relationship, but it's the same idea, right? The progressives were really enamored of this idea that by bringing people together, you could create a power, a democratizing force, in a sense. And so these progressives were actively fighting the hyper-individualism of their age, not just by articulating new cultural values, but by actually inventing new ways to bring people together. It's important to note and remember, as Bob noted, that we know from the data that this was a highly isolated, very disconnected, very lonely time, very analogous to what we are experiencing today. And largely that was driven then by the incredible demographic shifts of the Industrial Revolution. The generation before the progressives were living on farms and in small towns. They were living in an entirely different social setting that then shifted to cities, big, bustling, commerce-driven, anonymous cities. Many progressives literally found themselves sort of at sea without the cultural institutions that had grounded them before they made that shift. And so they really did feel a sense that they needed to invent and innovate around how to bring people together. And many of these reformers were doing this across lines of difference, not generally across racial lines. Again, we'll speak about that a bit more in a minute, but they were working quite mindfully across social class. As Bob mentioned, the gap between the haves and the have-nots, and the Upper East Side and the Lower East Side, those were communities that really rarely interacted with one another. And many progressive, innovative, visionary reformers were working on ways to bring people together. So by creating all of these new face-to-face ties, by initiating this civic boom, these progressives created vast new stores of social capital that drove this upswing for decades. Now, granted, that's what we mean when we talk about association as an end and a means. It was an end in the sense of wanting to assuage that loneliness and hyper-individualism, but also a means of creating further democratization, because as we know from Bob's important work around social capital is really a driver of the health of democracy in incredibly important ways. So another aspect of this was simply that it was a time of great grassroots innovation, huge grassroots surges of new ideas of innovation in what Louis Brandeis, who was a famous progressive, called the Laboratories of Democracy. These young reformers were really translating their moral outrage into citizen engagement. They were reclaiming their individual agency, citizen agency, in the face of sort of the dizzying drift of the Industrial Revolution and all of the changes that came with that. So ultimately, by working at the local level, at the level of the tenement, at the level of the neighborhood, at the municipality, progressives were able to create solutions that, in a sense, transcended the political gridlock at the national level that was a huge feature of the Gilded Age. And the progressive era, though we often think of it as these sort of big federal programs that were created, those federal programs really met the grassroots innovation so that this was both a top-down and a bottom-up reform movement. Interestingly, there was no charismatic leader that was really out in front of the progressive movement. The charismatic political leadership lagged, again, was a lagging indicator in this story, meaning that the Teddy Roosevelts came onto the scene as sort of political entrepreneurs who saw a parade and got out in front of it and successfully brought the parties together to create broad national reforms and legislation. But the real work of the period was happening a decade or more before that with this upswell of grassroots innovation. So again, there was no leader that came onto the scene and said, here's the blueprint for how we're going to change America. So these are all really important lessons that we think we can apply to today's problems. So we've highlighted, a lot of the positive things that the progressives did, talking about their leadership in leading this upswing, but not everything that they did was positive. And so from this era come not only lessons we might emulate, but cautionary tales that we would not want to emulate. And there are a number of those that we highlight in the book. I'll just mention one of them briefly, which is the most important one, of course, that this we that the progressives were working toward was simply not inclusive enough. Many of the progressives were themselves racist. Many of the reforms that they initiated had knit into them a sort of structural racism that we are now grappling with even today, 100, 120 years later. And so the fact that this was a highly racialized we that we were building toward during this last upswing really meant that the needs of people of color were sacrificed on the altar of progress, as we have seen so many times in American history. So if we want to see another upswing today, we certainly cannot make that mistake again. We must put full and complete inclusion at the center of our efforts. So those are some of the lessons from this period that we hope that maybe we can dig into a little bit in the question period to think about how we can apply them today. And just to wrap up, I'll leave you with this quote, if we can go to the next slide, from Teddy Roosevelt. He said, "The fundamental rule of our national life, the rule which underlies all others, is that on the whole and in the long run, we shall go up or down together. Whether we believe it or not, whether we lean into it or not, our fates are ultimately tied. And we believe that this is the biggest lesson of America's I century. That if we lean into the we, if we understand the power of the we and work together, that we can actually create not just a multifaceted crisis, but a multifaceted upswing. And hopefully we can move toward even greater heights of we than we were able to accomplish last time." So those are just a few of the thoughts from the book. We're so grateful for the chance to share this with you, and we really look forward to seeing what questions come, both from this incredible circle of presidents that we're joined with today, and also from the audience.
Thank you, Bob and Shaylyn, for just an amazing presentation. It's so full of rich information for each of us, and we're really very grateful. Before I ask President Lubbers to ask the first question and each of the presidents to ask one question, I'd like to remind our audience that they can put their questions in the Q&A, and I'll do my best to get them in front of our two wonderful panelists. So President Lubbers.
Well, I just want to say how thrilled I am by the presentation that both of you made. I'd like to ask this question. How does the bell curve thesis that you presented relate to the current racial climate and also to the current religious climate today? I'd like you to talk about where you think we are in terms of racial improvement, where you think we are in terms of religion, and do we need another great awakening?
Shaylyn, why don't you do the race part of that and I'll do the religious part?
Yeah, sounds great. Thank you for that really important question. So first and foremost, let's talk about race. Certainly no discussion of the American we can leave out of it a question of racial reconciliation. And so your question was about where we are today with race, but of course our story looks at where we are today with roots going all the way back to this 120 years ago. So if I can, I'll just try to keep it brief, but give a bit of a sort of an overview story spanning that entire period about race. And for those of you who are interested in this topic, I just will point out that we have a separate chapter in the book on race and one on gender that really look at this I period through each of those lenses. So I'll just give the briefest remarks now, but you can reference that if you want to know more. So I want to just start out quickly by saying that when we look at the 20th century in terms of race relations, there's often a sort of assumption that the 20th century was characterized by basically no progress toward racial equality for 2/3 of the century until we got to the sort of lightning bolt changes of the 1960s when everything opened up and changed. So the way that we would describe that is sort of as like a hockey stick. By contrast to our inverted U curves, you might think that the curve describing racial progress over this period would look like a hockey stick. No progress, great progress when we get to the mid-century 1960s period. And in some ways, it's important to recognize that that's really true, particularly when we're talking about measures of inclusion. So when we're talking about the longstanding lack of political representation, when we are talking about white supremacy in the mainstream culture and in the media, to some extent, residential segregation, the lack of entry into professional schools and jobs, like many of those measures that describe the sort of racialized nature of the country show that lack of progress for those first 2/3 of the century, and then significant progress in the wake of the civil rights movement. However, there was a surprise when we looked at all of the data, not just the data around inclusion, but the data around material equality toward the races. And I think actually we have prepared another slide here that we might want to just bring up to make this easier to illustrate. So if we have that other slide, that's great. So what we have here, again, we're looking at on the x-axis, you have here this same period that we've been looking at with all of the graphs we presented, starting at the turn of the last century, coming up roughly to today. And on the y-axis, you have measures of material equality. So at the top, we have 1.0, which represents full equality between the races. You can see here that we've not come anywhere close to that over the course of this entire historical period. But there are some surprises here. During that first 2/3 of the century, when we would have thought progress might be flat, on the contrary, we actually see sustained progress. Again, a short pause there that might be familiar from the previous graphs we presented, but actually the rate of positive change for Black Americans was actually faster in the decades that preceded the civil rights movement than it was in the decades that followed. And it's important to be clear here. We're talking about measures of material equality that include things like life expectancy, infant mortality rates, high school completion, college graduation, the earnings per worker, measures of wealth such as home ownership, as well as voter participation and voter registration. All of those measures are combined into this curve. And so the surprise here, and again, this is not necessarily a surprise for Black Americans, it's a surprise for the white Americans who sort of thought there was no progress and then lots of progress, when in fact, it looks more like the progress happened sort of during this we period, and then right in the moment when in broader society, we switched from a we to an I on all of the other measures we presented, we see a leveling off of progress for African Americans. Now, that's a surprise because in the wake of the dismantling of de jure segregation, you might think that what was already an upward trend toward material equality would have accelerated and continued up toward full equality. However, we see that on many individual measures, there was stagnation. And on several measures, there was a reversal of progress. For example, homeownership, rates of homeownership among Black Americans are lower today than they were when the Fair Housing Act passed in 1968. So when we talk about where we are today, what we see is that the Black Lives Matter protests are, of course, about racial brutality, or excuse me, police brutality and racial violence that is persistent in America. But they're also taking place against a backdrop of a half century of stagnation in the wake of the civil rights movement, such that the promise of the civil rights movement seems really to have borne no fruit for Black communities. So there's this enormous well of generational frustration amongst Black Americans who are calling America to account for these unfulfilled promises. And so, in terms of how this squares with the I, we, I story, there's a question of sort of what drove the progress during this we period. Largely, it was driven by Black Americans themselves standing up to claim their place within the we, largely through the Great Migration, moving out of the South and into the North and West, into more hospitable environments where they could own businesses and they could vote and they could attend school and access healthcare. And to a certain extent, what was driving this leveling off was the backlash, the white backlash to the civil rights movement. Americans were very much in favor of civil rights legislation as legislation, but when it became time to sort of reorganize the sharing of the pie, so to speak, Americans had a very not in my backyard reaction to that we think is an important part of this leveling off story that we see. So, one of the defining features of America's I period has been a heavy emphasis on individualism, both at both ends of the political spectrum. And that has had a huge effect, we believe, on race relations. So, we can't say which one caused the other, whether sort of this broader turn toward I caused the white backlash, or whether the white backlash was a part of this broader turn toward I. But it is interesting to note the corresponding period here when America sort of took its foot off the gas in the drive toward racial equality is the same moment that we switched from we to I. So that's a bit of a story about race, which again emphasizes the fact that any sort of upswing we would hope to see today simply must take full inclusion as its absolute first and foremost priority.
Thanks, Shaylyn. Let me just make one comment about what Shaylyn said, and then I'll be a little briefer about religion. Not that it's less important, but just because of the time. Remember, we wrote this book and described that curve before the Black Lives Matter and the George Floyd events and so on had even occurred. And yet, you can't understand the Black Lives Matter movement without realizing that many of the Black people and some of the white people who took part in those Black Lives Matter protests were reacting against that long period of foot off the gas. So I'm not saying that we predicted the future. I am trying to say you can understand what's happened in race relations in the last year, I think, pretty clearly by knowing something about this history that we wrote before the Black Lives Matter had even occurred. Religion is very important. I'm just going to have to be really super brief about it. And President Lubbers asked a number of different questions. One he asked is, do I think another Great Awakening is needed? And the quickest answer to that is yes, but I can't stop there. Religion is a pretty powerful social force. Shaylyn and I, about almost 10 years ago now, wrote another book about religion called American Grace, how religion unites and divides and unites us. And one of the things that book showed was that, in very simple terms, religious people are kind of nicer than other people. I'm very secular, and yet nevertheless, what we showed was controlling for everything else you like, people who are more involved in religious communities are more likely to help old ladies across the street. Sorry, that's an ancient frame. I don't mean old ladies. I mean people who need help getting across the street. Religious people are more likely to help them, and more likely to contribute to charities, and not just in the offering plate, but also to secular charities, and more likely to volunteer, and not just to be church ushers, but to volunteer to run the Little League and so on. So that's the high amount of social capital that there is in religion, and that's, as I say, I'm a secular person, but I think that's an important contribution that religion can make. However, it's important to understand that there are different kinds of social capital. In our jargon, there's bridging social capital, which links you to and connects you with people outside your own community, and bonding social capital. And that's connections which look inward and only connect you to other people just like you. And in the area of religion, an important part of religion, as I've just said, is the bridging social capital. That's what makes you likely to, if you're religious and in a religious community, more likely to help other people. But there's a powerful chunk of religious social capital. I don't want to start now getting too specific in terms of denominations, especially not in Western Michigan. But I have to say that there's a concentration today. Wasn't always true. It wasn't true in the Gilded Age at the time of the social gospel movement, but it is true now. An important concentration of bonding social capital I'll just put it this way, in the religious right, and therefore it's very powerful, but it doesn't have the same broadly positive social effects. And indeed, in some instances, that inward focus of that brand of religion is harmful, actually, to our progress. I'm tiptoeing here, not trying to be controversial, but actually trying to stick to the facts as far as I can see them. Forgive me, President Lubbers, if I've overstepped some boundaries here.
You haven't.
Oh. And Bob and Shaylyn, I'm going to keep you in this topic just a little bit. We have a Kaufman Interfaith Institute that one of our former Dean of Sciences leads. It's an important part. It's a very important topic. It's an important part of the legacy of West Michigan.
Sure.
You, Bob, I know had a relationship with the late great Rabbi Jonathan Sachs.
Absolutely.
And one of his comments: civility is more than good manners. It's the sum of the sacrifices we make to live together. Yeah. There is something we need to call us out beyond just ourselves. That's the return to the we again. And you tiptoed there through a little bit of what is it in religious communities that is good for the broader good, and what is it that may be a hindrance. But particularly, I'd love to have a little description from you and Shaylyn about what you see as the places where the faith communities, not necessarily in super dogmatic sense, but can be constructive for this necessary turn we have to make.
Well, President Murray, thanks very much. I very much, and I thank you for bringing Rabbi Sachs, the late great Rabbi Sachs, into not Rabbi Sex as it says in the transliteration, but Rabbi Sachs. He was a dear personal friend of mine, and he was, I would almost say, a saint. I won't go any further than to say he captured exactly the way in which religion must contribute to our sense of fellowship across all sorts of lines, but basically our obligation to help the other, and that's, in some sense, that's all I've been saying here. I would say you ask a very good question, which is, what is it about religion that makes the difference here? And it may be that Shaylyn and I have slightly different views about that, actually. My view, and this is represented in this book, American Grace, is that it isn't actually theology. It's rather the religious community. If you're a member of a religious community, that turns out empirically to produce amazingly positive results for the broader society. Theology we found in that study wasn't such a big deal. And indeed, one thing that's true, it's a startling way to put it, is that if you're an atheist, but you go to church suppers all the time, and you might say, well, how could that happen? And the answer is spouse. You go to the church suppers because you stay with you go with your spouse, but on the other hand, you're not really a believer. You're more likely to be a good citizen, including a good religious citizen, than if you're deeply devout and you're praying all the time and you're sitting in the pews alone. That's the sense in which empirically it looks to me as though, I don't want to dismiss people's theology, of course not, it's important to them, but I want to say that from a broader social point of view, it looks to me as if it's the community in religion. And of course, it's true also that different religions, some religions have a very I-focused theology. I mean, let's take a contemporary example. The prosperity gospel is a religion for sure, but it's very much focused on what religion can do for you personally. You're going to become more prosperous. And then there are many other religions that are we-focused, that are on the obligations you have to other people. And as you would guess, we think we-focused religions are more likely to contribute to broader social objectives.
Yeah, and if I might just add, I think it's easy to think of theology as something fixed that doesn't change over time. But actually, when you're looking at this period of change that we're describing, the theology of Christianity itself, sort of what narrative was being emphasized theologically, whether it was a personal salvation narrative or whether it was a Christianity as a blueprint for society, for an inclusive society, right? That changed variously over time. In fact, the social gospel was a movement about changing from a very personal salvation theology to one that was more socially informed. And so we even see that sort of theologically, we see shifts from I to we to I again. And the last thing that I'll just say, I know we want to move on, is just that, I think sometimes it's less about the theology and more about the aspirational narrative that religion can present, right? It's something that we can work toward, an ideal that we can work toward, much as Martin Luther King's beloved community was, right? It's something that we haven't achieved yet, but that we're constantly reaching for. And I think as people hear that and engage with that, it motivates them to orient their lives in that way. That certainly was true for the progressives, who were heavily influenced by utopian and aspirational narratives of their day,
Right.
some of which were religious, some of which were not.
Let me shift a little bit from these topics to this. You've used the term inclusive democracies, and we've been hearing more and more about a fragile democracy that we've seen over these past years. And now, given that 43 states and over 250 legislative initiatives are, some calling them voter suppression, they're limiting and challenging access to voting. Can we ever achieve an inclusive democracy, and as the Constitution say, the people, or is there going to be the governance system that's going to develop for 2021 beyond for the U.S.?
Well, this I'm sure both Shaylyn and I will want to say something to it, and the problem is to be brief. Look, I think that's the single most important question facing the country right now. And I say that Shaylyn will want to say something about it because it's clearly a racial issue, but it's not only a racial issue. I think that if America accepts, and I'm sorry, I'm going to be very partisan here. I don't mean to be partisan. I just think the way that the parties are breaking out over this leads me to say that those who are pushing these voter restriction laws are going directly against the main moral current of American history, directly against it. American history has never been, except in our bad moments, about restricting the number of people who take part in elections. It's been quite the opposite. Extending. All of our moments of progress have been associated with extending the suffrage initially, actually, way back beyond property owners. We've forgotten that. And then extending it to women, and then extending it very grudgingly and incompletely to Blacks and to other non-white minorities. If those initiatives that are being discussed, really right now, it was the subject of the news that I was listening to just before getting on this program, the ones in Georgia, that will be, in my view, a very, very bad omen for American democracy. It doesn't have to be that way. It's very, if you'll excuse the expression, un-American to think about moving in that direction. I'm sorry that feels a little bit partisan, but I'm not speaking as a partisan. I think I'm talking as an American.
So I think Bob's laid out the sort of doomsday scenario, which I completely agree with. But just to sort of, again, rewind the historical clock back to this moment that we're taking as our instructive moment here, when the Gilded Age gave way to the progressive era, there were similar sort of prophecies about the fragility of American democracy that were happening then, that were grounded in the on-the-ground realities of that moment. And what we're describing with the progressive era is a moment when individual citizens grabbed the reins of history, and in the words of Walter Lippmann, one of the most famous progressives, repudiated drift and engaged mastery. And it sounds almost like a corny thing, right, to say that that's where change is going to come from, but I think it really is. The average American, who I believe, Bob is right, is sort of morally oriented toward inclusion, needs to get out and make their voice heard and make sure that we are righting the ship here. That's what happened last time, and I think that's what's going to happen again. Now, last time it was imperfect. The circle of moral concern that the progressives were working within certainly did not include people of color, and that is, of course, something that we have to highlight as something we can't repeat again. And today, really, we're grappling with the legacy of that unfinished work. But I think it's also important. The last thing I'll say is that these are not just political issues. These are cultural issues. There is a hyper-individualistic mindset that embraces a broad narrative of competition that is driving these initiatives to disenfranchise voters. This is a competition, and we will do anything that we can to win. So we could fight that politically, or we could begin to fight it culturally by saying, this society is not a competition. This society is a cooperation. And changing that cultural narrative might have more power than making this always about partisan politics. So that's just another way to think about this that might actually have more power in driving us in the right direction.
Thank you. We've got a number of really good questions in the chat, which we're going to run out of time on, many of which you've commented on, which is great. And we'll think about what we need to do to maybe get some additional answers out to our audience. I want to be sure I get one question in, and that's the advice you have for our students today at this moment.
Well, actually, in a way, President Mantella, that's why we wrote the book. Our intended audience was young people. And I'm going to say, I know the time is going, but this is, from our point of view, really important. Young people did not cause this problem. Young people are frankly, the entire victims of this. It's people my age and other older people whose mistakes led to where we are now. But it's got to be these young people who fix it. That's exactly what we said earlier on. And there is a high risk, given where young people today are, and I'm thinking about your students actually, and my students. There's a high risk that they'll be cynical. They have every right to be cynical. They've never lived in a world in which was moving in the right direction, frankly. They've never lived in a we world. They've only lived in an I world. So they would have every reason to be cynical, but that's what we're trying to work against. We want to say to them, look, people just like you with exactly the same skills and gifts and weaknesses and foibles and facing exactly the same circumstance, they turned America around. And I want to therefore at the end here, repeat what Shaylyn just said. It's what we call agency. There's a sense that, we're just the victims of history. And nothing we can do about it. But what our study shows is that's simply not true. Those people 125 years ago, those young people 125 years ago, could have just let the world drift as the way, but they changed the world. By working together, they changed the world. And the message we want to convey to your young people is, you can do that. I know it's not your fault, but you have it in your power, and nobody else does, frankly, to change the direction of America and have us go in a much better direction.
Shaylyn, anything you'd like to add?
I would love to. I know we're short on time, but I would just add, I would really challenge young people today to prioritize the heart work, not the hard work, although it is the hard work, the heart work. I think to a certain extent, the racial reconciliation that this country needs to go through was kicked down the road by the progressives and essentially every generation that came after them. And I look to today's young generation, the most diverse generation in American history, to lead us in the direction of full racial reconciliation. That is going to be an extraordinarily difficult task, but it's something that we have to do. And we need our young people who have a more innate sense of inclusion to lead us all through it. And so I would say, don't just focus your efforts on the political, don't just focus your efforts on economics, focus your efforts on what's going to get all Americans to reinvest in that sense of the belief that we are all in this together. If we can have innovation, true innovation around the moral and cultural questions here, I think that's when we can begin to see more hope for an upswing.
Thank you. I'm not sure, President colleagues, that we can offer reflections that are stronger than those final two statements. So I would just say to the students that you are the youth that will be the drivers of our prosperity, the ones that's voice will resonate. To quote Shaylyn, you are the source of the next upswing. Prioritize the hard work. Thank you to each of you for such an inspiring, promising, and hopeful presentation. And thank you to my colleagues for your wonderful questions. And this is the conclusion of our series. So I want to also thank the Ford Foundation and the Hauenstein Center team for all their work in putting these together, and to wish you all a good evening and look to the promise ahead. Thank you.